welcome everybody, and on behalf of myself and Deb, we hope that you enjoy today's webinar. A quick overview of the presentation that you're about to receive. So I'm just going to explain the research team, background information, overview of this pilot study, some preliminary findings, and then looking towards the future. So who is the research team? There's myself, who's the principal investigator, and I'm located in the Health and Wellbeing Strategic Research Area at the Open University. We have Dr. Sarah Earle, who is Director of the Health and Wellbeing SRA. And then we have Dr. Deborah Morgan, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Innovative Ageing at Swansea University, and Dr. Robin Hadley, who's an independent researcher. And the team expertise is multidisciplinary. And as you can see, we have both technology and user experience, gerontology, loneliness, sexuality, identity. And what is great about this research team is we are experienced in mixed methods. So some background information, how did it all begin? Well, basically, I used to use dating apps and primarily use them for when I moved to the area of Milton Keynes a few years ago. And I've always been involved in technology from both a personal and professional perspective, and dating apps and just the whole dating experience in life. I've kind of moved with how society has changed. And when I was using dating apps, and I've used plenty, you know, Bumble, Plenty of Fish, Badoo, I started to notice, you know, seeing similar profiles, the kinds of information presented on dating apps within other people's profiles, but also the engagement and how messages were received and sent, which we'll come on to later on. More recently, myself and Deb have written a blog piece on the Ageing Issues website, which is associated to the British Society of Gerontology. And this blog piece is accessible to anybody, and there's the web link below. And we took the standpoint of Christmas and the pandemic, and as we all know, listening to respective media channels, Christmas was very different to what we have been used to in the past. And at the time of the second lockdown, certainly in England, you know, that came about at the beginning of November, and Deb and I decided to write this blog piece to kind of put our thoughts down, not only as individuals, but also as researchers. And in this blog piece, we spoke about relationships, loneliness, sex and intimacy. So please feel free to have a read of the blog piece, and you know, if you have any comments, you know, we look forward to hearing from them. Last year, myself and colleagues, we published a open access journal paper, and we did a bit of a scoping review of what kind of dating apps are out there available to anybody who is wanting to find various social, sexual, emotional connections. The paper itself took the standpoint of older people as well as young disabled adults who are 18 and over. And that was a particular interest of Sarah Earle. But whilst they're two very different cohorts, there's the potential to experience similar engagements through dating apps, sense of loneliness, sense of vulnerability, inexperience. So again, you know, if you wish to read that paper, contact myself or just use the link in the presentation. So from the scoping review, what did we find out? The design and privacy and cost and target audience varied. And in the paper itself, there's a whole host of different apps for everybody, whether you're gay, whether you're heterosexual, ethnicity, transgender. And in the paper itself, what I did was I broke down the different privacy issues relating to each app, what the age range was. So for many, it was 17 and over. What were the costs of purchasing in-app subscriptions? These varied considerably, and whether there was verification. So for some apps, to verify that you are a legitimate person, you have to take a selfie, maybe putting your fingers up like that, and that's done within the app, and then the app or the people behind the app, they verify that it is you. We also discuss in the paper the challenges to using dating apps, and there is fraud and bad behaviour basically. We've seen recently over the last couple of years in the media itself the young lady out in New Zealand who was murdered by a young man who she'd met on a specific dating app, and it transpires that he also used dating apps to have other dates. We hear of fraud quite a lot, and there's a national newspaper that has been rather prevalent with reporting fraud from the standpoint of older women engaging with communications with young men, and then their money's taken from them. Privacy, we know about privacy. Whenever we go on a website, we always have to accept all cookies. We also have the GDPR guidelines now, and privacy, as it is in the paper, it does vary. And then there's the sexual behaviour, attacks and self-confidence. For many people, including myself, you might receive some unsolicited messages or some, not so kind messages. And reading around the literature, reading newspapers, talking to people, even people on Twitter, they talk about, body shaming. Some people will only put pictures of themselves from the head above. So it's not for the faint-hearted, dating apps, but it's unfortunately this level of behaviour does happen. And within the future work and recommendations of the paper, we propose that there needs to be a greater amount of work to understand the social behaviour and the user experience. How do people and get on with setting up their dating profiles? Each app does vary, but they do have similarities such as, a name or a nickname, age, interests. In some instances, you'll get talking to people and people will say, oh, I'm 45, when they could be 55 or 35. Some people do change up their kinds of interests. Some will only use emojis to express what kind of likes and dislikes they have. In some instances with apps, some people will just have a profile picture or no profile picture and very little information. And from my personal viewpoint, sometimes one has to be wary of those kinds of profiles. In other instances, the nature of the conversation between two people can change very quickly, and that can be, can go from, hey, how are you? How long you been on here? Have you had much luck with finding a date? To more sexual advances. We also proposed in the paper itself that a classification system should be created, very similar to the classification system used for video games or for movies. And this recommendation would not only help people who use dating apps, but also the industry, the developers, but also policymakers. To date, there is really no legislation set in place to protect users of dating apps. A dating app that recently floated on the stock exchange is Bumble. And what is nice about Bumble is the user, women have to make the first move. They have to send the first message. So if you're swiping from right to left and you like a profile, then you have to send that message, and then that recipient has 24 hours to send a message back. Then they disappear, or they disappear from your profile and vice versa. So this pilot study came about initially when I was thinking about this. It was to conduct a pilot study to explore and understand the use of dating apps, and then the pandemic happened. And I follow several people on Twitter who use and blog about their dating app experiences. And I thought, that there's very little work about dating apps, and certainly from the standpoint of older people. And so basically I kind of revised the study design, invited Deb on to the project, given Deb's interest in loneliness and social isolation, and given how the pandemic has been unraveling the last 12 months for many people who are living on their own, who of all ages, for some people, that using a dating app is their means of engaging with somebody in the outside world. So this pilot study is a mixed method study, and we have data collection ongoing now with an online survey which went out in December of 2020 and will close of June this year. We're about to start interviews later this week, and we're interviewing 10 people, 5 young people 49 and under, and 5 older people 50 and over. And our theoretical underpinning is the life course perspective. Loneliness doesn't just happen, once you hit a certain age in life, and Deb will talk more about that later on. And our interviews will be conducted online for obvious reasons. And then once transcription has occurred, we will start to use IPA for analysis. And not only are we excited by this project, but taking and implementing this IPA analysis will certainly provide a rich insight and content to the 10 interviews that we'll be conducting. So I'm going to present some very preliminary findings, and this is literally a snapshot. But as you can see in front of you, and I've highlighted in yellow for certain locations, you can see where the majority of the online survey respondents live. And across the nation of the UK, the majority are from England, followed by Scotland and Wales. We do have other, and that could be for people who live in another country. For locations within the different regions, some are very, across Scotland, you can see they're all coming out the same. But as you can see, we've got Greater London, Cardiff, the Rhondda, which are very high. I live just outside of London, and I know through my own experiences, I've come across profiles that are located in London. Within the survey, we also ask questions relating to what kind of community they live in. So is it rural, small town, city? And as you can tell, the majority of respondents to date reside in the city. And the marital status, we are in a pandemic. We hear about loneliness from the standpoint of older people. But we don't really hear much about people who are single or divorced, who are living on their own. And as you can see from the marital status data, Many are single and some are also divorced. And we've got gender. Majority of people who have completed to date have been female. We also ask questions about whether they've had to self-isolate and whether they have a disability. Again, this is pandemic related. We know that many people have had to self-isolate for their own health conditions or for that of those in their own dwelling. The ethnicity and sexuality primarily is white British and heterosexual, but as you can see, there's a wide group of respondents. So with dating apps, literature to date has primarily focused on users of the dating app Tinder or Grindr, and that's been it. They've not really explored motivations or more broader reasons, rationale for using dating apps. And what was interesting and for this is to understand whether people have been using dating apps during the pandemic or during the lockdowns. And as you can tell, the majority of respondents, 65%, said yes, they have, whilst 3.75% chose to uninstall. And you can tell from their motivations or their rationale for uninstalling, it was based on their mental health, and they didn't see the point in using dating apps this past year. Whereas others were not looking for a date, or because of restrictions, they were not able to meet anybody. The types of dating apps primarily used have been Tinder, Bumble, and there's been others, Hinge, Elite Singles, Muzzmatch, Fab Swingers, and Facebook Dating. And in the blog that Deb and I wrote about last year, the Facebook Dating feature is relatively new, and for many who use Facebook, that will afford those individuals the opportunity to maybe connect with friends of friends or acquaintances. As you can see down below, the increase of dating app use during the pandemic, it's relatively close. Some people, nearly 39% said yes, and just over 44% said no. Sometimes, maybe for some people, depending on what is going on in their lives this past year, maybe they do feel lonely and they think, I'll try and reconnect with this person. So we asked we gave a lot of options for why people use dating apps. And I just wanted to pull out some of the options here. The majority was because they wanted to find love. Whereas for some people, friendship was close to 4%. And through my own personal experiences of dating apps, conversations can become very quick at times. So where in the real world, so to speak, you might take, a few weeks, or you might arrange to go on a date or meet somebody through a friend of a friend or through a workplace, you can get to know that person over time. Whereas in the world of dating apps, what I found was if a date wasn't really agreed, within a week, it wasn't really going to go anywhere. And in some instances, it can become very clear that for many people, they are only after one thing, and that's a sexual encounter. Whereas we can see, nearly 12% of people said that they wanted to build a connection with someone. And maybe that is because of the pandemic and knowing that, I can't go out and physically meet this person or travel on public transport, drive anywhere because of restrictions. The thought of building a connection with someone first and then with a viewpoint to meeting could be behind their motivation. as we can see, we've got nearly 6% of people saying because they're lonely. And, you know, what I've noticed with dating apps is if you're talking to somebody, you're just one of several people. And I've been guilty of that. And, you know, people who I've been talking to, they'll be talking to other people as well. And I've heard friends say it's a numbers game. To pass the time and for fun. I've been on public transport. I've been sat in my living room and I've been swiping through just for something to do. It's very varied really for why people use dating apps. We also wanted to understand whether the respondents of the survey viewed any safety risks to using dating apps. And in the second box on your screen, the types of risks experienced, we've got loneliness, catfishing, ghosting, breadcrumbing. If you're not familiar with the last three terms, catfishing is pretending to be somebody else. Ghosting is, you could be talking to somebody and then in the next minute, they disappeared, they're just not responding or their profile's deleted. And breadcrumbing is where a user will kind of just keep you hanging, basically, offering you breadcrumbs. As you can see with the types of risks experienced by the respondents, and I've highlighted some of them, they are varied and unsettling. And scamming, as I previously mentioned, that is one of the big risks of using dating apps. It's not uncommon for somebody to say, oh, let's chat on WhatsApp, or, kind of spin you a line, but they take time in doing this. So they get to know you, and then they kind of start to tell you a story in a bid to get money out of you. Poor mental health. We saw in a previous slide where some people uninstalled dating apps because of their mental health. Sexting and sexual images. We hear about it in the media or through friends. Sexting and sexual images does come with dating apps. And that's, this is why in the paper that was published last year about having some kind of legislation put in place. So many of us use technology. We use Facebook, we use Twitter. If I see things on Twitter, news articles, whatever, I'll share it with friends and work colleagues. Many years ago, when dating apps were just starting out, that it was new and it was not the norm. The norm was to meet somebody through friends, going to the pub, through work. But as you can see, many people do share their dating app experiences now with their friends and with work colleagues. Some also share with their siblings and parents. I think what has come about in probably the last 5 years or so is dating apps are now the norm. And, I'm familiar with friends who have found their spouses on dating apps. And then the living arrangements. We wanted to know whether some people who had met on a dating app during the pandemic or prior to the pandemic, but then asked that person to move in with them. I've seen that on Twitter. There's an account on Twitter that during the pandemic, they were sharing their experiences of living together. And they may have only, known each other for a month or two before lockdown last year. So not only with dating apps, but with dating apps comes being familiar with technology. And this is one of my ongoing research interests, is understanding the behavioural and impact of technology use on people. And here it just gives you a very quick snapshot of what kind of social media platforms are used by the respondents. And as you can tell, WhatsApp is a very popular platform. We know that WhatsApp, you can make video calls, phone calls, you can share images. And I've noticed in my own usage, I use it both for personal and for work. You know, you can create groups, so you can invite, you know, many of your friends or work colleagues. And the length and frequency of time using social networking sites, many people use them on a daily basis and have been using them between 10 and 15 years. In the box down the bottom, 29% of people use WhatsApp. It seems, you know, maybe like in the last couple of years, WhatsApp has kind of took the lead in bringing those connections together. So what's the purpose of using social networking sites? Stay connected with friends, and this is not an unfamiliar reason for using technology. It's something that I've come across over the last 5 years plus. Staying connected with family. Again, we know that in the pandemic, which we're still experiencing, the use of Facebook, WhatsApp, to stay connected with friends and family has become an important part of our lives. And whilst we're not always able to take photos, you know, of our day-to-day or travel or holiday at the moment, what I'm noticing, and I'm guilty of it as well, is memories are popping up. Memories from 7, 10 years ago, and I'm sharing them on my Facebook group. We've got sharing photos, to take part and following events and groups that people are interested in. Also to keep up to date with news. And, you know, again, sometimes we're familiar that there is fake news out there, but for some people, you know, maybe sharing news is their way of a coping mechanism. And the box down below, who introduced the respondents? We can see that for many people, it was themselves. They made the choice to engage with these platforms. Well, you know, it's through friends. So I'm now going to hand you over to Deb, and Deb's going to talk to you about loneliness.
So good afternoon, everyone. Having figures that Hannah spoke about actually align with those we see in national surveys. They come about 6% in the general population too. And I think what's interesting about this particular findings is that when we think about loneliness, we tend to think about why people become lonely and less about the strategies they might use to overcome or manage loneliness on a daily basis. And we know that loneliness has become a much bigger issue since 2020 because of the pandemic. We have more people who've never experienced it prior to 2020, now experiencing so-called lockdown loneliness or COVID loneliness. And from my own research on loneliness prior to 2020, it was often older male participants who were divorced who were reporting the use of dating sites, but to find a partner as a solution to loneliness. And I think what's unique about this data is that, and what I find particularly as exciting, is that we're seeing respondents to the survey telling us that they are using dating apps solely to alleviate their loneliness during the pandemic. But they're using it as a coping strategy to distract from loneliness, but they're also using it as a strategy to try to alleviate it. As you see on the slide here, the very first response we had there is that people living alone. And I thought the caveat to that is we mustn't assume that everyone who lives alone is lonely. In fact, and as you'll see later on, people who are lonely actually live with other people as well. And it's got the quality of the relationships. And as we know, the pandemic is putting relationships under strain because, we're all locked into houses together, and, it might not be the best situation for some people whose relationships were rocky to start with, or if it's a new relationship. So what is clear is that for some people, dating apps are clearly loneliness driving a driving force behind the use of dating apps. And people are taking risks to address their loneliness during the pandemic. We can see that people are saying, they're trying to build relationships. And quote 6, I live alone, I want to have sex. And they're taking risks not just in terms of the risks that Hannah highlighted previously, but they're taking risks during the pandemic. They're connecting to people, physically connecting to people, and putting themselves at risk of COVID-19. And while we don't condone this, we can understand it, I think, from a human perspective, because as humans, we're social animals, we actually need to be with other people. And as I said, this we can see this in quote now, but that feeling of loneliness and the prospect of maybe finding a life partner are being key drivers of the decision to actually go into a dating app. Can you put the next slide up, please, Hannah? Thanks. And again, in this slide, there's a lot of text, but I think it's important that we give a broad overview of the issues that are facing people in relation to the lack of social contact. And what strikes me about this data is that, so as I said previously, it's far more of a driver than we initially anticipated. And the sites portray themselves as places where you'll find a partner, you'll find true love. But actually, it is loneliness seems to be driving a lot of people to the sites. And we have, before, I felt more sad and lonely than I've ever felt before. And it's difficult, I find it hard to admit to family and friends how sad and lonely I am. And this is not unusual. People who are lonely often feel unable to tell others how they're feeling because there's a stigma around loneliness. And people who feel lonely may not necessarily think that a loneliness intervention is for them, particularly if they're younger, because we tend to associate loneliness with older adults. And in fact, the data shows that younger people probably experience more loneliness than older adults, because older adults who are lonely may have found strategies across a lifetime to cope with it in a way that's better for them, whereas younger people don't have that life experience. But what we do know is that people are putting themselves at risk of chronic loneliness. We talked earlier about breadcrumbing and ghosting. There was data that has Hannah showed that 6.67% of people were at risk of loneliness, they were at risk of loneliness. And the reason they're at risk of loneliness from using these dating websites is because if you're being ghosted, or you're putting all your eggs in one basket, that you're putting all your hopes on meeting somebody via a dating app. And if people can be cruel, they can be, they make adverse comments, or you can be ghosted, and then that has an impact on you as an individual and can actually tip you into chronic loneliness. And we know that there can be negative mental health consequences from being rejected as well. So it's not just the physical implications of dating apps and contracting things like STIs, but it's also the mental impacts that they can have. And I think what is important about this study is looking at the younger age groups as well as older age groups, is that we know that sometimes for some people the route to loneliness is put down much earlier in the life course. So if you're a young person and have a very small network, as a young person, you're less likely to have a larger, more diverse network as you get older. We know that large, diverse networks protect you from loneliness. And to sort of illustrate this, there was some research done several years ago now in Sweden, and it was with childhood cancer sufferers and survivors. And they found that the survivors of cancer in childhood were less likely to be married or have a partner than their peers or their siblings. So it's something about having these damaged networks early in your life course that can actually increase your vulnerability to it as you get older. And of course, we know that if you're lonely, it does make you vulnerable to other negative impacts such as scamming and financial abuse and and in some cases physical and mental abuse. And I think it's for this reason that this research is so important, because there's a cohort of people out there who are hidden from view. They're not in the loneliness statistics necessarily, They're not finding support for their loneliness down other routes, that they're using dating apps to alleviate loneliness for themselves. Which suggests, when we think about loneliness interventions, actually we should be looking at far more diverse interventions and maybe teaching people the skills, the social skills, and the skills to manage to alleviate and cope with loneliness if you do experience it, because it is an emotion that at some point we will all experience one way or another. I want to bring us back to the data now on the next slide. If you could put the next slide up, please, Hannah. And I think the very first quote here is the lack of physical contact being the hardest. I think we underestimate the power of touch. And this is something that people who are alone often express, that there's no one to touch them, to hug them. And we know touch is really important because it releases endorphins, which is oxytocin, which is important because it helps us bond. We associate it with new mums, and new mums release oxytocin during childbirth, and it helps them bond with their child. But we also release it during sexual behaviour and pleasure. But any form of social bonding or positive physical contact can trigger its release. And it's important for our physical health because it reduces blood pressure and it buffers stress, which, as we know, is hugely important in the middle of a pandemic. And we know that loneliness over a long period of time has health implications, so touch can buffer some of those effects. But you can see in quote 3 here that the participant is talking about the physical symptoms they've experienced because of loneliness. They're talking about loss of self-esteem. We're talking about things like vertigo. And they found that the online interactions actually took on more meaning. And that's not unusual. I was, the previous work I'd done with older adults, and one of my participants started going to youth classes just to be able to try and learn how to use spreadsheets. And he actually found that those classes took on new meaning for him because he was building relationships with younger class members. And it's the same here with people who's this person who's using dating apps, but the online interactions are taking on a deeper meaning for them. It's not just I'm just trying to find a date or offer pleasure. It means something far more to them. But we know that loneliness, particularly over a long period of time, can lower people's self-esteem, and that can then tip people into chronic loneliness. But also, two-way streets of people with low self-esteem are more likely to be lonely. So you can get this self-perpetuating cycle. If your self-esteem is being negatively impacted by your use of dating apps, then you're tipping yourself potentially into chronic loneliness. And you can see on quote 4, this individual here is very lonely. And it goes back to my comments about living alone. This person lives with their husbands, and they feel a lot of guilt because they're looking for attention online from other men. And again, this is impacting on their self-esteem. So we know that loneliness relates to the quality and quantity of relationships, including marriage. And Dion Gavard done some research a few years ago looking at the quality of marriages and loneliness. And it's clear that this individual in one of our participants experiencing it and searching for validation and attention elsewhere to alleviate their loneliness, try and repair their self-esteem through the use of a dating app, which again may bring some unintended consequences if they're rejected or damage to their existing relationships. So it's not about this risk. But as I said, it's clearly being dating apps are clearly being used as a coping strategy. And as you can see in quote 6, to end on a positive note, for this person, it's been a positive effect overall. And I think it goes to show that actually when we think about loneliness and interventions and the way people cope, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all. I'm going to hand back to Hannah.
Thanks, Deb. Our next slide is just, what are the next steps? Well, I've already mentioned that we're about to start interviews later this week. And as I say, there's going to be 10 interviews, 5 younger adults and 5 older adults. And we've still got the survey open until June. And then once that closes, we will start to analyse the data and then start to work you know, writing the findings up and presenting and working with stakeholders who may be interested in understanding how dating apps are used by service users and communities, with a view to looking at, you know, recommendations and offering support. So here's our contact details. Please feel free to contact me, and if you want to know more about the project, there's the project website. And I provided you with some resources, and if you want to have a look at other people who I mentioned earlier on Twitter, here's some Twitter links and web links to their blogs, to podcasts. My mate Paddy, he has a podcast on Deezer and other platforms, and he talks about his own dating experiences with dating apps and his sexual activities, along with Bumbling Dad blog and Lucy Goes Dating. They're all of various ages. I don't know what they look like. I don't know their names, but it will give you an insight into the experiences and trials and tribulations of people dating in the 21st century, and not only in a pandemic. If you wish to complete the survey, please go to the link below. And if you do use dating apps and you would like to be interviewed, please contact me directly. And on behalf of myself, Deb, and other members of the research team, thank you for attending today, and we look forward to sharing more findings and in the future. And we hope that this work will certainly impact policy at both region, local and national levels. Thank you.
Hi both, we've got a question of Susan. With regards to perceived risks of dating apps, are these similar to general societal dating risks but now just reflected online?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent that could be the case. I think with dating apps, because it is that one-on-one communication in that virtual world, and it seems it's a quick environment. It's not, you know, for some people, they don't tell their friends or family that they're going to go on a date and they've met this person online. So without saying to somebody, oh, you know, this is who I've met, and you know, there is that enhanced risk. It's very intense when you're doing dating apps, and I think what is different these days is prior to dating apps, you could meet somebody, a prospective suitor, and there would be a friend of a friend or a work colleague or through a hobby or whatever, and you would be able to find out about them. You know, you might know their family or other friends, and kind of have that opportunity for that person to be vouched. Whereas online dating, there's nobody to vouch for that person. You don't know whether that person has good intentions. And in one of the slides that Deb was talking about, one of the respondents from the survey mentioned about they'd experienced an increase in OnlyFans profiles and prostitution. I remember using a particular dating app, and I sent a message on the profile, and basically this person, he was offering services. On his profile, there was no mention of his behaviour. That only came out in private messages. And I think with the scamming and the fraud as well, I think, you know, when people are wanting to find love, maybe have been widowed for a long time, there's that vulnerability. And dating apps, again, it's that that personal, intimate engagement. Whereas meeting somebody through a physical environment, there's that vouch. You know that that person is good, similar activities, interests, etc. Deb, do you have any more comments for that?
Yeah, and I think people who were lonely prior to the pandemic, or even during the pandemic, actually, if they're using dating apps now, it's probably for them a much easier environment to go onto a dating app because it is slightly more anonymous, and that you're not putting yourself out there into a social setting, so it feels like you're one step removed from that. And of course, because you're lonely, it just makes you more vulnerable to the people's negative behaviours, which can then have implications in terms of chronic loneliness.
And it can create the illusion of intimacy, can't it? If in the old days, if you had a boyfriend or a girlfriend, you'd phone them maybe once a day or whatever. Now somebody can text you 20 times a day and it can be normal. And it makes things, as you said, Hannah, earlier, it makes things progress far more quickly. But it's just an illusion of intimacy. It isn't real intimacy. And I think it's really sad that so many people are getting scammed by these. I saw a program a while ago about a man who he paid for someone to come over from Nigeria on a plane to meet him, and of course he was there at the airport with a big bunch of roses, and nobody arrived, and he was waiting. And one of the aircraft staff said, "Well, I can't give out any personal information, but I can tell you that there's no point you waiting here." And he paid thousands of pounds for someone to, for some non-existent person to fly to meet him, and he was totally engaged, totally in love, and totally scammed. It's just heartbreaking, really.
Yeah, and in the paper that I published in the section about fraud and scamming, I've cited quite a lot of different news articles which report on this fraud and scamming, where unfortunately it's older women, but men are also vulnerable to that kind of behaviour as well. And I'm not just talking 5,000 or 10,000, sometimes it's like £200,000 has been sent overseas. And that there is, they've been on very famous and popular morning programs talking about scamming, and there is no legislation in this country. There's no protection.
I remember an American colleague telling me a project that they were doing a while ago, and they knew somebody was being emotionally and financially abused by someone who they met on a dating app, and it was an older person, and they understood that they were being financially and said emotionally abused, but felt that was the price to pay to have that relationship, to keep that ongoing. And you think, well, how people can be really desperately lonely, and will do anything to alleviate that, that feeling. And I know there's been a move again in the States where you can now employ somebody. You can hire a person to come out and spend time with you, doing the activities you want, kind of on an hourly rate, because so many people are lonely. They think that's we're commercialising loneliness effectively, aren't we?
We've got two more questions, please. First question from Susan Williams. Are there any online dating apps that are more age-friendly than others? So over to you guys.
Well, yeah, there was. It was called Lumen, Lumen, and I went to look at it the other day, literally just yesterday, and apparently Bumble have bought it, so I don't know what's happening there. And funnily enough, I've also seen television adverts for that particular Lumen app. But you could, when you create your profile on, say, Bumble and other apps, you can put your own age in, and then you can also choose what age range you want or that you're interested in meeting. So they're not all, for the younger demographic. Lumen's been taken over by Bumble.
I see. So another question, quite similar. Are the dating apps tailored for older users, especially 75 and over? If so, could you tell us in what way? So are there any, are they tailored in any different way? Please.
I didn't access Lumen at the time last year, or even the year before, when I started exploring this research area. Regarding, are they accessible for people over 75? In what way? Do you mean through accessibility features? Normally you would put a profile picture up, you would be asked to put a short bio, and this is primarily done on your smartphone. In some instances, there are some online dating websites like eHarmony and Match, and they're a bit more extensive with their profile. So when you create your profile, they will do compatibility tests and stuff like that, which may or may not be suited to everybody. I think really this is also a little bit for future work as well, is exploring what kind of features older people as well as younger people would want. Not everybody wants the same information as you would get on the existing dating apps, maybe.
Got one more question. I'm just going to pull it up on the screen. Sorry, I can't see it. No, I'm going to hand that to you, Owen, unless you can see it.
Yeah, there's one from Caroline Lloyd. She's wondering if any work has been done on attachment styles and online datas.
Attachment styles, was that? No.
Yeah, attachment styles and online datas.
I imagine that would be clingy people or avoidant or that sort of thing.
I think that kind of information and user behaviour will potentially come out in interviews. The existing literature surrounding dating apps, as I said at the beginning, features Tinder and Grindr, and they don't really look at attachment and that level of detail.